Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our Feminine Form Ayurveda session. I'm so happy to welcome you to the space. I'm just going to wait a couple more minutes to let everybody in. So just give me a moment to welcome everyone in. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Beautiful to see you all. Welcome to Ayurveda in the feminine form. Let's just start with a very brief orientation and acknowledgement. So just coming to sit with a tall spine, gently closing down your eyes, relaxing your jaw, feeling a spaciousness around the heart center. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. May all beings everywhere be happy and free. May the thoughts, the words, and the actions of my own life contribute in some way to that happiness and to that freedom for all. Acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we sit. For me, that is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Acknowledging all the teachers that come before us in the lineage of Ayurveda and Bhakti Yoga. And acknowledging the wisdom keepers from our own personal culture and ancestry. Namaste. Beautiful. So thank you for joining me. I'm so excited to have so many of you here in the space and interested in these teachings. And I really feel, it's really interesting. Over the last few years, I've really felt that more and more I've started to come into teaching from a place of my own real embodiment, interpretation, and understanding. Like I'm in my mid-40s now, and I've been practicing yoga and Ayurveda since I was in the middle of my teenage years. So, nearly 30 years. And I can honestly say that the first 20 to 25 years of my teaching was a lot of me sharing with my own flavor and my own understanding, but sharing what I had learned from my teachers, like very much continuing the lineage of what I had learned, particularly from two teachers, Sharon Gannon, Jivamukti Yoga, who was my teacher from the age of 18 and still is my teacher now, in the yoga lineage, and Maya Tawari, Mother Maya, who is my Ayurveda teacher. And then many other teachers. I mean, like you guys, I'm a forever learner. So I've, done a zillion different yoga Ayurveda courses over the years. But they're my main teachers. And a lot of what I've taught in the last, the first, let's say 25 years of my teaching career is my own interpretation of their teachings with their blessing. I mean, that's absolutely as it should be. That's what lineage means. But I find myself now, a very interesting thing has happened as I've moved into my middle years and I've kind of matured as a teacher and as a human being. My teachers, both Sharon and Mother Maya, have moved into retirement. They're both in their mid-70s now. They're both teaching a lot less, and they've really deliberately and intentionally handed the mantle of teaching to their senior devotees and their senior followers and teachers. And so with the blessing of my two teachers, I now continue to expand and, share these teachings. But what I've noticed happened as that transition occurred, that they moved into retirement and that I continued to teach and share, and of course practice, because our teaching and our sharing is innately linked to our own embodiment and our own practice, that the teachings have become, in some ways, my own. And the way that I'm sharing now and understanding and contemplating isn't as influenced by having my teachers share information with me. It's more through my own sadhana, my own understanding, my own practice. And so what that means is that I'm developing my own body of work, I guess you could say. And it's
Man,
heavily influenced by my teachers and by the teachings I've received from them. So, it's very much connected to authentic lineage. It's not like I've just kind of gone off on a crazy tangent and started like just making stuff up, but it's like my own interpretation. And what I've realized is, surprisingly, because I'm not a very, I don't consider myself an artistic person in the traditional sense. I'm very much a words person rather than a sort of drawing or illustrating person. But what I've realized is, over the last few years, and particularly even the last couple of years, a lot of the way I understand Ayurveda is mapped out visually in my mind. It's almost like I have these kind of diagrams or these visual representations, which over the years I go to sort of map out how healing can occur through these teachings. Now, if that sounds a little bit abstract, the time that we're going to spend together over the next few weeks is my attempt to make it less abstract and a bit more available for me to share with others and, with you. So I'm super grateful that you're here to go on that journey with me. Today's session is very much about setting the foundation. So I don't have a diagram or a visual to share with you today. I do have a list, a bullet point list. But today's session is very much about just the foundation, like laying the ground of what do we mean by feminine form Ayurveda, because it's easy to bandy these terms around, right? Divine feminine, feminine flow, feminine form. It doesn't really mean anything unless we create some parameters around definition. So we're going to do that a little bit today. In the following sessions that come, we're going to look at some of these visual representations that I've created, a tree of life that represents how healing happens in the body, diving into subtle anatomy and subtle body by looking at Kundalini. We're going to look at a chart of the way that female hormones in the body also map out according to our moon cycle and the cycles of the moon. So we've got all these different areas of Ayurveda to dive into, really connected to these visual representations. And I actually feel like, I hope, that the way that I've created these handouts and these diagrams, which have completely come from my heart and my crazy imagination, will help you understand Ayurveda in the feminine form. Because when we go back historically, what we find is Ayurveda was very much taught in the masculine mode by men. So the history of Ayurveda is that it was a male lineage. The doctors of Ayurveda were, they were male, and it progressed through a male line. And it's very much in the mode of the masculine, the way that it's been taught. So this means lots of rules, lots of regulations, lots of logic, like, 1+1=2, A to B goes to C, like lots of sort of formulas. And the beauty of Ayurveda is that it's never one size fits all. So it's never like, we always do this thing or we always do that thing. It's always dependent on the seasons, the stage of life, so many different factors. Even with that in consideration, still the way that Ayurveda is presented is quite prescriptive. It's quite linear. And if you look at the original scriptures, like, for example, Charaka Samhita, which is our sort of original encyclopedia of Ayurveda, it's very formulaic. It's very much like, if you have this disease, you should eat this food. If you are suffering from this imbalance, you should balance it with these protocols. And that's beautiful. And there's a place for that. I'm certainly not throwing that away, but it can lead to us feeling very constricted, right? Like, in order to do Ayurveda right, there's a whole bunch of rules we have to follow, and if we don't, we're kind of failing. We're not true Ayurveda practitioners, or we're not true students of Ayurveda. And it's really my desire, partly because in my own life there's no way I can follow all the rules of Ayurveda. Like, I just, I would be failing every time my kids ordered Domino pizza. That's it, instantly cast out of the Ayurveda rule book. And that's the reality of my life, is that I'm raising 5 children in a modern Western world, and I'm also living in that world. And it's a balancing act, right? Like, it's a constant trade-off or exchange of what is culturally normalized, a lot of which is really toxic and unhealthy and not nourishing, and what Ayurveda would have us do, a lot of which comes from Vedantic living thousands of years ago in India, which isn't congruous with the way that we're living our lives over here. So it's like, how do we find the balance without lots of guilt, shame, feeling like we're failing? And that's one of the intentions of the feminine form, is that we let go of all these very strict lists and sort of austere paradigms of this should be done in this way, and we find a more gentle and flowing way. So I've created some sort of bullet point notes, I guess you could say, for today to really talk you through what I think Ayurveda in the feminine form is. And as I said, that's our foundation to then launch into the discussions around hormones, healing disease, subtle body, etc., etc. One of the things I want to say from the very beginning for all of our time together is, as I've grown and matured in my approach to, well, in my life and in my approach to Ayurveda, another thing I've really become very clear about is that it's very possible for things that are different or could even feel contradictory to sit together and be true at the same time. So I think a real sign of maturity, and I really want you guys to get this, a real sign of maturity in our spiritual practices, in our lives, in our health, in our wellness, is when we can know deep within ourselves that paradox can exist, and that it doesn't mean that certain elements aren't true, right? So that we can exist within paradox. Like, a very simple way of saying that and thinking about that is in our relationships. I'm struggling a little bit in my relationship with my 10-year-old son at the moment. I'm finding him really challenging, right? We're going through a tough time, and he's going through a tough time. A lot of behavior challenges, a lot of bad manners, and yeah, just things that disrespect, things that I really don't go well with. And so I find myself, actually, if I'm being really honest, some of the time not really liking him very much, like finding him quite difficult, even to the point where if we're going to go and do something like, a family activity, there's a part of me that's like, oh, he's going to spoil it. Like, he's going to make it difficult. Right. And then at the same time, of course, I deeply love him. So I'm able to dislike him and even not want to spend time with him for now, right now, and also deeply love him. This is a real paradox, right? This is like two almost polar opposites that exist in the same time and space, and can be reconciled. So it's quite immature on our spiritual path for us to be very binary in our thinking, very polarized in our thinking. And this happens a lot in Ayurveda, that we kind of go, this is the right way, don't drink cold drinks with your dinner. It's the wrong thing to do. It's not Ayurvedic, right? But then, of course, there's always another possibility. There's always another argument, another layer, another reasoning. And so when we really step into maturity and the feminine, this is what the feminine can do, we start to see that it's possible for various different things to be true at the same time that may seem to contradict each other. In other words, we start to see the shades of gray instead of everything is black and white. And I actually feel like women are so much better at doing this than men, or the feminine, we could say, does this a lot better than the masculine. I was having a conversation with my eldest son about American politics the other day, and he was he was actually saying something quite sexist that really offended me, where he said that men are in general stronger leaders than women, and that it would be preferable for men to be in positions of power in politics because they have more dominance than women. Okay, he's 18 years old and he is my son. I have raised him the best I can. I was quite disappointed to hear that come out of his mouth. But anyway, we were discussing it in more detail, and the argument I made was women have the capacity to see things from lots, or the feminine. We talk about men and women, but we could also talk about, masculine, feminine. The capacity to see things from lots of different points of view. And actually in politics, that's a really important skill, right? That you can balance out different perspectives and see different perspectives, even if you don't agree with them, and make decisions from that place rather than making decisions from a polarized place of we should go to war or we should, whatever the decision is, it's very black and white. And so this is where the divine feminine comes into our healing journey as well, that we start to become aware that the road to healing anything, any imbalance, any disease, whether it's in your physical body, your mind, emotional regulation, your energy body, is multifaceted, and we need to see it as such, and we need to be able to approach it in that way, right? So, for example, let me just give you a very tangible example. You might have someone in your life whom you know needs to make some changes to be healthier. Perhaps this person needs to stop drinking or needs to stop smoking or needs to change their diet, right? And it's really obvious to you that this is what this person needs to do, or it could even be yourself, in order to come into better health, right? Now, that's one polarity. And you could give this person a range of different protocols: give up smoking, stop drinking, eat better, and it would lead to better health for that person. But we also have to hold in heart and mind and in our communication other factors, like, for example, maintaining connection. So let's say this person is your parent, right? If you come at it like you need to stop drinking, you need to stop smoking, you need to stop eating meat, you're killing yourself, what that does is it creates disconnect. It probably doesn't facilitate them doing all the things you're suggesting. In fact, if anything, it might push them further the other way. So what if we come at the conversation with ourselves and with our loved ones with the foundational piece being, let's remain in connection. What if instead of me being irritated by my 10-year-old son because he's being rude to me, I come at our interactions with the overriding desire being to let's maintain connection. And then from that place, we can talk about changing behavior, changing lifestyle, changing the way that we speak, etc., etc., etc. Do you see how that's so different to the sort of prescriptive, you need to do this, and even with ourselves, what if we could be gentle with ourselves, kind with ourselves, maintain connection with ourselves first, and then move into making changes? This is where Ayurveda has so often failed, in all honesty, because it's been very much about judgment, prescription, and what is the right thing to do, that kind of attitude. Okay, so I'd like to run through some of the elements that I think really define feminine form Ayurveda, and I'll just say very briefly that my teacher, Maya Tiwari, my main Ayurveda teacher, who is a woman, learned Ayurveda and grew up in Ayurveda. Her father was an Ayurvedic doctor and her guru was a male, very much battling the patriarchy. She had to work so hard to get access to these teachings, and it is to her absolute credit and just magic and alchemy that she was able to share these teachings with thousands of women the world over, including me and now including you, and see them through the lens of the feminine. So I just really want to honor her for that, because any struggles that we may think we have with the patriarchy or with sort of being women in a male dominated world and within male dominated paradigms, and certainly the medical system is very much dominated by that, our struggles are minute in comparison to what she went through. So I really want to honor and acknowledge that. And also, in this essence of not polarizing, I want to say very clearly, and you'll hear me say this again and again, that I'm not saying Ayurveda is better than any other model, and I'm not saying that we need to exclude Western healthcare. There's often a point at which Western pharmaceutical, surgical, modern technology is a real complement to Ayurveda, or Ayurveda is a real complement to Western medicine. So I believe just as exactly as I've said that we can have two different polarities sitting together at the same time, that Western medicine and Ayurvedic medicine can sit in harmony together and support each other. So I'm going to pop into the chat now your handout for today, and that will be also where the recording, you'll be sent a link to the recording of today's session and ongoing sessions, and you'll find that handout there as well. So the handout is going to be available. It's here now, but it's also available for those of you who are here live. But if you're watching the recording, you'll have access to that too. Before we jump into the notes on the handout, which I'm just pulling up so I can see as well and continue to see all of you, bear with me. Yeah, before we jump into that, I want to share with you a few other notes that are my other notes around, what is feminine form? What does it mean, feminine form Ayurveda? So one of the first things is the idea that, and this is sometimes a really hard one to do, that we take something complicated. Now we're listing what are the elements of feminine form Ayurveda, or feminine form anything really. We take something complicated and we make it simple. We take something complicated and we make it simple. Now this is enormously skilled. And what happens is when we make something simple, we can sometimes second guess ourselves and feel like, oh, it's not good enough because it's too simple. So a good example is sharing an Ayurvedic cleanse, right? Inside my online membership, Bhakti Club, we do an Ayurvedic cleanse twice a year. And I have the temptation every time it comes around again, we'll be doing it again this month because we're transitioning into spring, summer, I should be adding something different. I should be mixing it up. Like, oh, it's just the same old thing, khichdi again, uh, uh, cutting back on alcohol and caffeine again. And we've done this 6 times already. What am I going to do that's new and different? No, this is a mistake to think like this. Repetition and simplicity are the gifts of these teachings, and they're what we need the most. So if you're teaching this content, if you're sharing it, or even if you're doing it in your own life, keeping it really simple, foundational level, and repeating yourself is not only okay, it's actually essential. It means you're doing it right. When things get really complicated and they're always new and they're always different and they're always complicated, we're not practicing feminine form Ayurveda anymore. Think about what a young child needs. So often what we need in Ayurveda is to be healthy and well is what young children need. So those of you who are mums, even if you're not a mum, a lot of it's obvious. What do young children need to really thrive? They need to feel safe. They need to have enough sleep. They need to be well nourished, and they need routine, right? If you take those things away from kids, and they need sensory stimulation that's not overwhelming or scary or confusing, right? If you give those things to a young child, that child will thrive, like literally thrive. Safety, sleep, food, rhythm, and sensory, what we would call sattvic or sweet sensory input. Now, in our culture, in our modern day, it's really difficult to deliver those 5 things to a young child. They're eating junk food, they're playing computer games, they're staying up late, they're overstimulated. This is the culture that we live in. So as parents, and when we're parenting ourselves, we have to work quite hard to keep it simple. So don't think that taking something complicated and making it simple is easy. It's actually really difficult. And our culture is enormously complex. The way that we live, the internet, the constant stimulation, the busyness, the pace of life, the decision making, it's crazy. So if we can find simplicity, routine, rhythm, sensory delight, if we can find nourishment, if we can find rest, if we can find safety within that, we're performing a miracle. Like, it's nothing short of a miracle. So taking that which is complex, which is our culture, and finding simple application. asking, particularly when we come to the traditional teachings, asking, how does this apply to me, to my family, and to my community in my own lived experience? In other words, taking the theory and asking the question, how does it apply to me in this moment? So let's go back to the theory of you shouldn't drink lots of fluid and you shouldn't drink icy drinks during a meal. Now that principle does apply in Ayurveda. Generally speaking, we want to take liquids separate from food, and we also don't want to drink lots of cold drinks. And so I would say 95% of the time that rule applies. But if we look at that rule through the lens of how does this apply to me, my family, my community, my lived experience in this moment, let's say it was a really hot day and it was like 35 degrees and you were sitting outside eating a meal and everyone was boiling hot and sweating. A beautiful iced lemon mint water to go with your meal would be completely appropriate in that moment. There would be absolutely nothing wrong with it. So yes, there are the rules, but then there are always the exception to the rules. And the exceptions come through our lived experience, our embodied experience. Or imagine you had gone to someone's house and you didn't know that person very well, and they had made an enormous effort to create a beautiful meal for you. You know, I don't know, let's say you were meeting your new partner's family for the first time, right? And they had made an icy drink that went with the lunch or went with the dinner, right? In that moment, forget about your physical body. The energetics of refusing to eat or refusing to drink would be potentially hurtful or awkward or just cause some disconnect. So just drink the icy drink, right? Because time, place, and circumstance in that moment, it's just kinder, it's sweeter, it's more relaxed to take a small amount of the drink. Right? We don't have to be so rigidly stuck on the rules. This is something Mother Maya used to talk about so much. She used to have a print, or she still does. I often speak in the past tense because she's in such deep retirement that I very rarely receive teachings from her anymore. But she would say over and over again, food for one must be food for all. And for a long time, I didn't really understand what that meant. But what she means by that is we need to be a little bit less precious about how we apply these things in our lives, right? Like keep it simple and think in such a way that you're not so special, right? You don't get to like have all these special things that you need in order to be healthy. It's like, actually, no, we need to think in much broader terms of like what works for everyone. If you're causing a big fuss about the way that you need things done for you, that goes against the feminine form, which is, and I'm not saying you don't ever advocate for yourself or ask for what you need or create, you know, I'm not saying that. Like, you know, I'm vegetarian, I don't eat meat. I wouldn't eat meat in any context. Wouldn't matter if it was offensive to someone or upsetting. That's a hard no from me. So there are boundaries. I'm certainly not saying that, but I'm saying be laid back, be easeful. Don't be the difficult person. It's nothing worse than a difficult vegan or a difficult vegetarian that just spoils everyone's meal with their special needs, right? Be calm about it. Maybe you don't need to make a big song and dance. You just subtly don't eat the meat or you subtly don't drink the icy drink. So this is something Mother Maya taught us a lot, like be good advocates by being easygoing and friendly and personable. Another big important part of divine feminine is, or feminine form Ayurveda, is honoring lineage. So we do that in my work through Bhakti Rose with the 3-part acknowledgement, where we first of all acknowledge the First Nations people, then we acknowledge the tradition and the lineage of Bhakti and Ayurveda, and then we acknowledge wisdom keepers within our own personal culture and ancestry. That's a really important part of the feminine form, is to acknowledge our teachers and our lineage and to remember that we don't stand alone in these teachings. Another important part of the divine feminine teachings is to align our values and our actions with what we're teaching and to share from that. So in other words, don't be a hypocrite. If you're struggling with something, my recommendation would be either don't teach about that thing until you've resolved it, or authentically share with your students that you're struggling. Now, we have to be careful about that because our students and the people that we're sharing with are not there to help us process the world, right? So if you're in the role of the teacher, you need to show up in the role of the teacher and not in the role of, oh, I've got a whole lot of stuff I need to dump on everybody about what's going on with my mother right now, or what's going on with my bowels right now, or whatever it might be, right? So what I've received from both my teachers is that you work through something, and when you have something of value to share at the other side of it, then you can talk about that and share it with your community, but you don't share while you're in it. So if you're in the middle of an IBS flare up or an argument with your mother, you keep that in its own sacred container and you work through it. And then you share, if you're in the role of a teacher or a guide or a leader, you share once the lessons have been learned. You don't dump on your students while you're in process. And that's something social media, I think, often does us a disservice, because in social media, we're often sharing in real time whatever's going on for us. But my personal belief is it's actually really important as guides and teachers to, again, hold a sort of separate and sacred space. And again, we can come back to this idea of young children, right? Where you don't expose young children to everything that's got the nuance of the complexity of everything that's going on for adults, right? You keep it simple for them. And then likewise, as teachers, we need to have some capacity to be able to contain our own stuff, right? Not to the point where we're completely impersonal and we never share anything, but to the point where we're not leaky. We're not energetically leaky. Another element of divine feminine is, and this is an unpopular one, is it's a long game. It doesn't happen instantly. Healing is a slow process. We often take 2 steps forward and then 2 steps back. It works in spirals and circles. It doesn't always work in a straight line. So, you know, for example, Mother Maya would often say, if you're trying a new protocol, like a dietary change or a herb or a specific treatment or a lifestyle change, 6 months is the window for the trial, right? Not 6 days, not 6 weeks, 6 months. If you really want to see if something's going to work for you. So it's very, very different to the Western, I've got a headache, I take a Panadol, the headache's gone within 20 minutes approach. It's a long form, long game approach. And it can be really hard for us to accept, but it is what it is. Another element of divine feminine Ayurveda is the importance of apprenticeship, learning under mentors. I mean, you all understand this because you're here doing continuing professional development, always being in a mode of learning, always reading, studying, being open to new perspectives, being willing to change your mind. This is part of feminine form Ayurveda. My teacher would, the way she would express that is being in apprenticeship, but not necessarily an apprenticeship to one person, but in apprenticeship to life, always being open to growth and change and study and deeper understanding. And then finally, from this particular list, and this is possibly should even be number 1, this should be at the top of the list, it's the most important, believing that people can change and believing that healing is possible. Believing that people can change. We're innately good. My teacher, Sharon Gannon, always says, see the other person as a holy being. When you're having an argument or a disagreement with someone, when you're irritated by someone, when you are triggered by someone, see that person as an angel in human form. See them as a holy being. even if they're a very toxic, very dysfunctional person. It doesn't mean you have to have them in your life. It doesn't mean you have to take on board what they're saying. It doesn't mean that you have to become submissive to them. But we see other human beings, other beings, and animal beings as well, as holy, as from God, as sacred. And in doing so, we see that they could potentially change and that healing could happen. This is the primary foundational belief around, Ayurveda. Literally, the word Ayurveda means the wisdom of a life well lived. It's healing through complete holistic visioning of what we are as human beings. And the only way that healing can happen is if we see the seed of potential for goodness, for growth, for sattvic living within every person. The Buddha had a very beautiful way of describing this, and I love this image. The Buddha said, every person is an angelic being. Every person is sattvic. Every person is pure. Every person is good. But we all have a different amount of dust covering that inner light. So for some of us, the dust is very thin, and we can just dust it away, and then the radiance is really visible. For some of us, we're under a huge amount of dust. We're under a mountain of dust, and it's very difficult to see the light inside. But the work of healing, the work of Ayurveda, the work of spiritual development is to clear away that dust. And actually, it's a really beautiful story. When the Buddha first attained enlightenment, Siddhartha first attained enlightenment, his best friend and first disciple or first devotee, Ananda, begged him to teach what he had discovered, how he had attained enlightenment. And Buddha, Siddhartha said, I don't want to teach. I can't, I don't have words. I don't know how to share it. Like, it's just too hard. I just want to be a recluse and go off and live in a cave and be enlightened on my own. And Ananda basically begged him and petitioned for him to teach. And what Ananda said to the Buddha, it's one of the famous slokas in the Pali Canon, the Buddhist scriptures. He said, "My Lord, they have but little dust over their eyes. Like, they can almost see. They're so close. Please just help us remove the last little film of dust so that we too can step towards enlightenment. They have but little dust." And so next time you feel very frustrated by someone or very judgmental, like you're looking at someone, you're thinking you're so whatever it is, just remember this term, they have but little dust, and that deep transformation is possible. Milarepa, who was one of the Buddha's greatest followers and greatest advocates of Buddhism, was a murderer. He killed many people before he became a Buddhist. He was a bloodthirsty murderer, and then he became one of the great beacons of Buddhism. This is a story of what transformation is possible. So let's remember that in ourselves and also remember it in others. I'm going to pause before we go through the other points of feminine form Ayurveda, which I've got in your handout. I'm just going to pause and see, does anyone have any questions or comments, anything you'd like to ask me based on what we've spoken about so far, or anything you'd like to share? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Hey, Katie, where can we find these notes?
So the notes that I've just shared with you will be up where the recording is. So when you get the recording link, the notes will be there. And the one that I've just dropped in the chat will also be there too. It'll all be there with the recording. You'll get an email later today that gives you those details.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any questions or comments? We're all good?
Sorry, I can't see any in the chat.
Okay, maybe I didn't actually. Yes, thank you. It's because I didn't post it. It was just sitting there in the box ready to go. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, you've got it now. All right. So this is a kind of continuation of what we've already covered around what is feminine form Ayurveda. And I'm going to invite you to scroll down a little bit towards the second part of the notes to begin with, which compares feminine medicine, and we're using medicine in the broadest term here, not medicine as in something that you take, but medicine in the bigger sort of healing definition, and masculine. So let's start with the masculine form. So masculine form is our Western paradigm. And again, just to repeat myself, I'm not in any way saying that the masculine form is not valid or helpful or needed, because it is. You know, it saves lives. And I feel very strongly that we need to not polarize. So the masculine form is based in science, right? And this is what most of us learn in high school. It's like you have a hypothesis. I mean, this is like high school science 101. You do your little experiment, you test it out. The experiment is controlled. So you're comparing apples with apples or oranges with oranges. You're not comparing apples with oranges. And then through that experimentation, we prove, is our hypothesis correct or is our hypothesis incorrect, right? Everyone's familiar with that model. It's pretty much, it's really interesting how we're taught this model in high school science, and this is how, for example, Western medicine is developed. My very first boyfriend, who I came to Australia with, did his PhD at Cambridge University in the UK, and he's a scientist. He worked on HIV. In fact, the reason I live in Australia now is because his job got transferred to the Westmead Institute, which is in Western Sydney, where they do, it's one of the leading HIV research units in the world. And he came out here, and then I followed him, and the rest is history. And I'm still, you know, close with his family, and you know, we're still friends. And his whole life was around this model, this scientific model. He, you know, would spend hours and hours and hours in the lab doing things with cells, testing HIV virus and how it behaved, and then creating hypothesis, and then experimenting again and again and again, and coming up with, you know, medications and pharmaceuticals that could actually reverse what the HIV virus did in the body. So extremely important, very valuable approach. And a whole decade of my life was spent making sure his cells stayed alive. Like, we would do things like go away for the weekend, and then we'd have to like race back because his cells were dying, or you know, he had to add something to some petri dish or something. So, you know, it's a very very regulated and linear, and very much in the mode of the masculine. But then this way of working, we then apply it to a lot of other things in our lives, right? It's taken over a lot of our thinking, where we logic is given precedence over intuition again and again and again. There isn't really a place for intuition in this scientific model, and we need intuition. We need that circular thinking. It can't all just be this scientific model. Then another part of the masculine model is statistics. So statistics often influence how certain things are done within medical models in the Western world. So, for example, childbirth is a really good example of this. They might say, statistically, women who have a baby that weighs X amount will get into trouble in childbirth, and so therefore it's a good idea for us to induce before you go past 40 weeks of pregnancy, because statistics show us blah, blah, blah. Now, in that particular woman's case, it may or may not be true that her pelvis is small and her baby is large, and she's going to have some challenges with childbirth. It's just that the statistics show a certain thing. Or statistics show that babies who are given a vitamin K shot after birth are X amount less likely to get internal bruising or bleeding than babies who aren't. So we give every baby the vitamin K shot because statistically it shows outcomes are better. Now, the trouble with statistics is that we all become guinea pigs. We're all beholden to the statistic. So it is a difficult ethical dilemma. Like, statistically, if everybody gets immunized, then diseases are reduced. But if I choose that I don't want to get immunized, I will probably not get sick because everyone else did it, right? So that's like you're kind of riding off the fact that everyone else has immunized themselves. You may not agree with that perspective, and that you're totally entitled to have a completely different opinion. But I chose personally to delay immunizing my children. And I knew it really, in many ways, from my own perspective and opinion, it was a selfish choice because I was riding off the fact that everyone else did it young. And so childhood diseases were, to a great extent, eliminated. So that's a statistical piece. It's very relevant. It's meaningful. It's based in logic, but it doesn't mean that whatever is statistically true necessarily applies to you, to an individual person. And then we have the naming and the labeling, which is very much part of the masculine mode. Everything is compartmentalized, it's categorized, it's ordered. And in Ayurveda and yoga, this is the Sankhya philosophy. So Sankhya is one of the Vedic philosophical branches or schools. And Sankhya is about putting things into boxes and giving them labels. It's very much the ordering, the scientific, and the masculine. So the reason I popped that in there is just to indicate to you that Sankhya philosophy is, or the masculine mode is also part of Ayurveda and yogic wisdom. It's not all in the feminine. There are definitely areas of Ayurveda and the masculine model that are in connection to one another. Okay, so then we go to the feminine form, and I'm not going to go through feminine form in detail because I'm going to actually share with you a whole other webinar, a whole other video that goes through the feminine medicine model in detail. So this model where we move from, this is like a healing protocol. We're on the left-hand column now, feminine medicine, and it goes through 7 stages of methodology for healing yourself. So the first one is to look at nature's rhythm. Then we look at lifestyle considerations like stress and sleep. Then we look at food. Then we might start to look at some protocols like Abhyanga or yoni steaming, or, you know, many of the other protocols that are available to us in Ayurveda. Then we look at herbs. And finally, we look at pharmaceutical, Western medication, and or surgery. So we move through this these stages of application for healing. And what usually happens in Western medicine is we go straight to the herbs, the pharmaceuticals, and the surgery. We miss out the first 4. So in feminine form, we become really interested in the first 4. And then the final 3, the herbs, the pharmaceuticals, and the surgery, are like the last resort. And I'm going to share with you, as I just said, a whole other recording webinar that you guys can watch in your own time that goes through that 7-stage protocol in a lot more detail. And so if you're interested in how that works, it's very much part of Ayurveda's teachings. And yeah, it like is an important part of the jigsaw puzzle, important piece. Why do we jump to those last 4? Well, one of the reasons, there's lots of different reasons, but one of the reasons is that colonialism had a big impact on Ayurveda. And this is also part of where the masculine feminine forms sort of intersect, and we can have a discussion or a reflection on that. So, you know, Ayurveda is the indigenous Indian medicine system. It's indigenous to India, and it's been around for thousands of years. When the British colonized India a few hundred years ago, they brought with them the Western medicine system, and it became seen as a better system than Ayurveda because they had, you know, things like surgeries and antibiotics and what have you. And so it became that the herbs, the pharmaceuticals, and the surgery were seen as the gold standard of healthcare, and the other things were seen as the pre-colonial village, less than modes of healing. But actually, that's such a shame, because in those first 4 stages of the feminine path, we can heal so many different things. I mean, we can actually reverse cancer. We can heal autoimmune diseases. Like, we can really reverse the symptoms of menopause, perimenopause, infertility, like you name it. Like, these first 4 areas, looking at the rhythms, looking at lifestyles, looking at food, and looking at natural remedies or protocols, can do enormous, profound healing work for us before we have to jump into the final 3. Okay, and then just jumping back up to the top of our feminine form Ayurveda handout, some more points of distinction around what feminine form is. And again, this is a bit of a random list. It's really just my list of what I consider, like when I sat down and really brainstormed what is feminine form Ayurveda, because we talk about it, or I talk about it so much, and creating some definitions around that. This is what I came up with. So the first point is, and this might sound really cryptic and esoteric, but it's a foundational piece, that we simultaneously sit up and sit down at the same time. Now, what does that mean? It means in our bodies and in our relationship to the earth, we are both upright and elevated, but we are also connected to earth and grounded. And when we can find connection to heaven and connection to earth in our bodies and in our way of being, we find balance. Now, we'll talk about this a lot more when we start talking about Kundalini and we go into the tree of life. We'll get a lot more on this. So there's more coming on this, but it's definitely a form of feminine form healing that we have connection to the earth below and the infinite above. The feminine is a container for the masculine. So women, and I know you guys know this, if you're a heterosexual woman who's been in a relationship with a man, particularly if you've lived with a man and you've had a family and you've got children, you know that your mood, your level of wellness, your vibe sets the tone for the whole family unit and for the relationship, right? And it's one of my biggest frustrations of being a woman in relationship with men, right? It annoys me that if I'm in a bad mood, the whole family crumbles like a deck of cards. And then if I'm in a good mood and I'm capable and I'm well and I'm happy and I'm upbeat, everyone is elevated by that, right? I feel like I would like a partner who could also do that role as well. And I'm not saying that never exists, but it certainly hasn't existed much in my life. And it's in the scriptures. The scriptures tell us the feminine is the container for the masculine. And we're going to talk about this more when we talk about Kundalini, because when we look at the Kundalini teachings in the scriptures, they talk about the bowl of the yoni from which the masculine arises. So we are the container. Meaning, if you're good, if you're stable, if you're steady, if you're happy, if you're calm, if you're grounded, everyone else around you is too. It's a bit of a burden, I feel, but it is what it is. And so it is a little bit of that teaching of, care for yourself first so that from that space can rise up the container of everything else that needs to be cared for. The feminine, and this is an interesting one because I would think of this more as masculine, but the feminine burns away what needs to go. She is not afraid. Devi, the goddess, is not, this is the Kali energy, right? Kali is not afraid to sit in the fire, chop off the heads of those which are arrogant, predatory, evil. It's like we are willing to say no to protect ourselves, to protect our families. And at the same time as the no and the boundary, we also gather in what needs to be initiated. And that, by initiated, meaning we've got clear boundaries. We bring in what's needed to be contained and held. And we also hold away that which is toxic and needs to be burned away. There is radical responsibility for our own emotions and feelings. We're not in the blame game and we're not in the projection game. We're holding responsibility. Impeccable boundaries, that really links into burning away what needs to go and gathering in what needs to be initiated. Evolutionary potential of your heart, that really means what I spoke about before, which is this idea that everyone has within them innate goodness. So your heart and the potential of your heart, but also the potential of all those around you, is innately good. It's innately well. It's innately healed. And then we sit together in circle, we yarn, we build altars, we create rituals, we drink tea. Those last ones are like the fluffy definitions, but nonetheless still important, because what's more elevating than being in a circle of women, drinking tea, chatting, creating ritual, especially when we're uplifting each other, especially when we're seeing the good in each other, we're creating the sacred, we're creating beauty, we're creating the divine. This is the deepest essence of what it means to be in the divine feminine. So they're my notes, and my invitation to you, and I truly extend this invitation. I really mean it when I say this. My invitation to you is that you think about whether these resonate for you and almost create your own idea of what the divine feminine is in action. And there may be some elements that I've shared with you today that don't resonate, that you're like, no, that's not quite right, that's not quite it. And there may be some that feel very strongly aligned, and there may be others that I've omitted that you would include. So I really want to encourage you to think about what is the divine feminine in action for me? Like, what would your bullet point list be? And of course you can use mine as a foundation, but I want you to really embody this work and make it your own. I want you to think about it in a way that goes beyond just being given a list and then kind of like following along, but rather is really deeply embodied with your own thinking and feeling. Because that's when we start to, that's when the lineages and the teachings become alive. They become alive because we're actually thinking about them in the context of our own lived experience. Diane is saying she loves the idea of connection with the paradoxes. Have a lot of confirmation around this recently. It's really interesting when you start to hold space for that. It's a very nuanced way of thinking and being, but it's very, for me, it's been very powerful. Does anyone have any last questions or comments? Feel free to pop something in the chat if you would like to, or unmute and just speak briefly. Anything you'd like to share or ask. We've got a couple of minutes left for that. Okay, beautiful. Well, this work is to be continued. Today was a foundational piece. All of the notes will be up along with the recording, so don't worry, that's all coming. And I really look forward to continuing the journey with you. This is just the beginning. But as I said, what would be a really beautiful and helpful little bit of homework for you to do before we go further is just really reflect on what are the pieces of divine feminine or feminine form Ayurveda for you, what resonates, what doesn't, and maybe even start thinking about creating your own list or your own blueprint around that. Have a beautiful day, ladies. Thank you for joining me this morning. So lovely to have you all here. I'll see you all again very soon.